Hey everybody, this is Kelly of Rojo Chief Clothing, and in this video, I will concentrate on how black was a slave status and still is today a slave status, and also the distinction between American Negroes and African Negroes, how they made a clear distinction between two groups of people that were on plantations or who was listed on slave schedules. And we already had touched on Indian slavery and what happened and how it happened, and how Indian territories were turned into the southern plantations, and how the Indians were already growing tobacco and cotton already prior to the Europeans coming over here to the Americas. So let's get into it. We're going to look at this picture here that's above, and on this picture, as you will see, it's a list of slaves that were field slaves that obviously worked in the field growing, tobacco, cotton, and other crops such as corn and so on and so forth, right? So now as you look, you will see where it says American Negro, which are obviously our ancestors, the American Indians. And then you see African Negro. Now, that goes back to what Erica Coleman had said, that the autochthonous one had brought to the forefront a couple years ago, when he had discovered and he had shared with us that there was a difference between the use of Negro and African Negro, and that she discovered the reason why that is because Negro was a term that was used originally for people of indigenous descent, which is our people. So anyways, so when anybody says that, oh, we're all the same, but this proves it not to be the case. And we also know that the Creoles are actually American Indians as well, that are allegedly mixed with French and African ancestry. So you see that they also make a distinction between the American Negroes and the Creoles, and the one African Negro that was listed amongst all the slaves. Okay, Black Code in history. It says, any of the numerous laws enacted in the states of the former Confederacy after the American Civil War and intended to assure the continuance of white supremacy. Now, you had to think to yourself, if these people were supreme, or they were better, or they was, superior to their counterparts that they want to deem as having the black status instead of the white status, then they wouldn't have needed any of these so-called codes or laws in order to prove their supremacy. But anyways, it says enacted in 1865 and 1866, the laws were designed to replace the social controls of slavery that had been removed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And it says United States African American Slave Code. That's what they're saying. Okay? But we know that most of our people are not of African descent, that they are American Indians. Okay? And it says here, the black codes had their roots in the slave codes that had formerly been in effect. The premise behind chattel slavery in America was that slaves were property, and as such, they had few or no legal rights. The slave codes, in their many loosely defined forms, were seen as effective tools against slave unrest. It says particularly as a hinge against uprisings and runaways. Enforcement of slave codes also varied, but corporal punishment was widely and harshly employed. The black codes enacted immediately after the American Civil War, though varying from state to state, were all intended to secure a steady supply of cheap labor, and all continued to assume the inferiority of the freed slaves. It says there were vagrancy laws that declared a black person to be a vagrant if unemployed and without permanent residence. A person so defined could be arrested, fined, and bound out for a term of labor. if unable to pay the fine. Portions of vagrancy law enacted by the state legislature of Mississippi in 1865 provide an example. And then you see here, it says, Section 2, be it further enacted that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes, which we know all these terms they was using when it was talking about people that was of American Indian descent, even though in the public school system they lie and they try to make it seem as though they were talking about people of African descent only. They try to make it seem like they was only talking about people of African descent. But anyways, it says, in this state, over the age of 18, found on a second Monday in January 1866, or therefore with no lawful employment or business, or found unlawfully assembling themselves together either in the day or nighttime, all white persons so assembling with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes, or usually associated with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes, on terms of equality or living in adultery or fornication with free man, free Negro, mulatto, shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction thereof shall be fined in the sum of not exceeding, in the case of freedman, free Negro, or mulatto, $150, and a white man, $200, and in prison at the discretion of the court. The free Negro not extending 10 days, and the white man not extending 6 months. Be it further enacted that all fines and forfeitures collected under the provisions of this act shall be paid into the county treasury for the general county purposes, in case any free man, free Negro, or mulatto shall fail for 5 days after the imposition of any fine or forfeiture upon him or her, violation of any of the provisions of this act, to pay the same. But it shall be, and is hereby made, the duty of the sheriff of the proper county to hire out said freeman, free Negro, or mulatto to any person who will, for the shortest period of service, pay fine or forfeiture of all costs. Then you see it says apprentice laws provided the hiring out of orphans and other young dependents to whites, who often turned out to be their former owners. It says some states limited the type of property African Americans could own. And we know that most of the people weren't of African descent. So, anyways, and it says in other states, black people were excluded from certain businesses or from the skilled trades. It says former slaves were forbidden to carry firearm or testify in court, except in cases concerning other blacks. It says legal marriage between African Americans was provided for, but interracial marriage was prohibited. Then they say it was northern reaction to the black codes, as well as to the bloody black riots in Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana in 1866, see New Orleans race riot, that helped produce radical reconstruction in the 14th and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865 to help the former slaves. It says Reconstruction did away with the black codes. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, many of their provisions were enacted in the Jim Crow laws, which were not finally done away with until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so basically what they're telling you is that these codes, which we know codes are not laws, they were included in the Jim Crow laws. And then they're claiming that they were done away with when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. So, okay, let's look at what they say about the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, now this is what they say. They say Freedmen Bureau, which is also known as United States Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It says it was established 1865 through 72 during the Reconstruction period after the American Civil War. Now we know that Reconstruction, what they was actually doing, they was rewriting our history. They were claiming our people to be of African descent when they knew that they weren't of African descent. and they knew that they were Aboriginal people, that they were calling Negro, Black, and Mulatto, etc., etc., right? So here you go. It says, a popular name of the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, established by Congress to provide practical aid to, it says, 4 million newly freed, and it says African Americans in their transition from slavery. But that doesn't make sense, as you know, because when you look at it closely, and we're going to look at this, when you look at it closely, President Lincoln, he had made mention of, according to them, I don't know how accurate it is, but, you know, allegedly that he was telling the freed slaves, to join an Indian tribe, or to, you know, basically. And to me, that wouldn't make sense for people that were supposed to be of African descent, especially considering the fact that if they were of African descent, then why didn't you just send them back to Africa where you knew they came from, instead of telling them to enroll in American Indian tribes? But anyways, so it says, headed by Major General Oliver O. Howard, the Freedmen's Bureau might be termed the first federal welfare agency. Despite handicaps of inadequate funds and poorly trained personnel, the Bureau built hospitals for and gave direct medical assistance to more than a million freedmen. More than 21 million rations were distributed to impoverished blacks as well as whites. Then it says here, it says, and the greatest accomplishments were in education, where 1,000 black schools were built and over 400,000 spent to establish teacher training institutions among the historically black colleges and universities. Let's pause. Now, we know that those historically black colleges and universities, most of those were originally Indian schools, okay, that they later on called historically black institutions. And we know why they did that. Those are part of the Reconstruction era, right? To cover up the fact that the people that they were calling black and Negro were actually the Indians. So anyways, it says that received aid from the Bureau were Atlanta University, 1865, now Clark Atlanta University, and Fisk University, 1866, originally Fisk School, named for General Clinton B. Fisk of the Tennessee Freedmen's Bureau, and who gave the school its original facilities in the former Union Army brackets. Howard University, founded in 1867 through an act by the U.S. Congress, was named for Major General Howard. Less success was achieved in civil rights, for the Bureau's own courts were poorly organized and short-lived, and only the barest forms of due process of law for freedmen could be sustained in the civil courts. Its most notable failure concerned the land itself, thwarted by President Andrew Jackson's restoration of abandoned lands to pardon Southerners, and by the adamant refusal of Congress to consider any form of land redistribution. The Bureau was forced to oversee sharecropping arrangements that inevitably became oppressive. Congress, preoccupied with other national interests and responding to the continued hostility of white Southerners, terminated the Bureau in July 1872. But because this was an act of Congress, which we know that means that it was voted on by both the House and the Senate, this is law. This is law, as we know. So my thing of it is that I feel that the racist Caucasians, who were the real people that was poor because of their circumstances, of them coming over from Europe and not having anything, and our ancestors being farmers and had already had the cotton industry and the tobacco industry and the hemp industry already, and the fur trade already on lock, that they were, using this basically as an excuse to continue to steal the land from our ancestors, the Indians. Okay, that's how I look at this. And they knew that those lands that were made into plantations, that those plantations that were under these, I would say, businesses, which are colonies are, they were companies like the Virginia Company, or what they want to call the colonies. Virginia Colony was actually a business. So, yeah. And a lot of those plantations that were under these businesses were actually, American Indian lands, as we already know, and that those southern lands and Indian territories were turned into plantations. So, okay, so we're just gonna leave it there. Okay, so we're going to look at this state of HBCUs. This is black and red, Hampton Institute, Indian Education at HBCUs. And as you see here, this is an Indian chief, and then here are some Negroes, and some mixed Negroes and some unmixed Negroes that's here in this photograph. And we already know what they're going to do. They're going to try to say that these people were black slaves, but more than likely they weren't slaves. They were probably free people of color. Okay, so we're going to dodge that. And and also I also saw that they said that these people were of Indian and African descent, but they know that according to the census records and marriage records, that that's not the case. Okay, so we're going to dodge that hijack. Like Carol Mayo would say, we're going to dodge that, okay? We're not going to pay that any never mind, because we know that's not true. But anyway, it says a report came out several weeks ago that sparked a heated debate concerning our nation's controversial history of race relations. Headline reads, Cherokee Nation expels descendants of tribes, black slaves. And that's, pause it right there. We know that the Aboriginal Cherokees, the original Cherokees, were classified as blacks, whether they were free or whether they were enslaved. But we know for a fact that enslaved Indians were called black because of the Christian black codes, okay? Now, it says the article discussed actions taken by the Cherokee Nation to amend their constitution in order to remove slave descendants and other non-Indians from tribal roles. And then it said here, it says, while there are too many points of contention to list here, I did want to address some of the blatantly racist, mean-spirited, uninformed comments regarding race relations amongst African Americans and Native American populations, which said prior to Christopher Columbus accidentally founding America. Well, we know that was BS because, as Carmel said, he had wrote it down in his diary that he was looking for the city of Jerusalem, which is in the country of Peru. So anyways, it says Africans had long visited and interacted with Native Indian populations. This interaction continued throughout the days of American slavery, as enslaved Africans and displaced Indians joined together in swamps, the Great Dismissal Swamp, all the way down in Seminole territory to create maroon societies. Now, we're going to stop that right there because they're trying to give you the impression that the Maroons were people of African descent, and that's not the case. The Maroons were American Indians, okay, were American Indians that was fighting, and then they lie and turn around and say that the Maroons were people of African descent, okay, and that's not true. They were really of Arawak descent, okay, and other, American Indian descent. But anyways, it says to resist oppression of the dominant society. Moreover, blacks and Indians, which we know blacks and Indians they're the same people. They just, chose to list them differently for whatever bias and racist reasons, right? It says coexisted in various educational institutions after slavery led by Hampton Institute. Thousands of Indians mixed, worked together, and thrived together while receiving a top-notch education from Hampton and sister schools. And it says while most students and alumni of HU recognize Wigwam as the Office of Student Affairs, it first served as a dormitory for Indian students. In 1875, Captain R.H. Pratt, and Bishop Henry B. Whipple. Yes, that is Whipple Barn. Is named after partner Samuel Armstrong to begin an unprecedented venture in educating the minorities of the nation. And let's stop that right there. Minorities. How the heck could we be the minorities in this the 1800s? They said that there were millions of us here. And as, you know, many of our sisters and brothers have said, the Europeans didn't come here until the late 1880s, early 1930s. So there's no way that we would have been the minority at all, not by a long shot. Okay, so let's continue. Let's see here. It says at the time Hampton was already well en route to become one of the leaders in African American education. It says Armstrong believed industrial training had already yielded tremendous benefits in uplifting blacks, thus in theory the same to prove for Indians. On April 18, 1878, 15 Kiowas and Cheyenne Indians arrived as students in the early hours of the morning. The experiment grew rapidly, yet it was received by mixed feelings as Indians were unsure of how interacting with blacks would fare, while blacks feared the invasion of Indians would convert the institute into a criminal house. Between 1878 and 1923, roughly 1,388 students representing approximately 65 cultures, I don't like voluntarily using the word tribe, attended the school. It says the number included the Sioux, 473 students, the Oneida, 194, the Seneca, 112, the Cherokee, 61, and many others. And then it's showing you people that appear to, look like they had Native American ancestry. Which we know Native Americans are people that they say that have migrated from Siberia and Beringia, okay? The Native Americans. Well, we know that the Aboriginal Indians, which is us, we're not, we were the ones that was called Black and Negro. So we know that in this article, more than likely this person doesn't know that information, and they're just assuming that that a Negro is a person of African descent, because you see that they said African Americans, which that term was not used in the 1800s. And the people weren't called Africans, they were called Negroes. And we know that the people that are known to be Negroes originally are the Indians. So anyways, it says one of the first to oversee the education, growth, and development of the Indians was none other than Booker T. Washington. Well, we know he was a sellout. It says in his monumental work, Up from Slavery, he details his experience as a house father beginning in 1879. Here is an excerpt from his writing. It says, I was to live in the building with them and have the charge of their discipline, clothing, rooms, and so on. And going to Hampton, I took up my residence in a building with about 75 Indian youths wigwam. I was the only person in the building who was not a member of their race. I knew that the average Indian felt himself above the white man, and of course he felt himself far above the Negro, largely on account of the fact of the Negro having submitted to slavery, a thing which Indian would never do. It says Washington reveals problems Indians on assimilating to the dominant culture and similarities between Black and Indian students. It says, I found that in the matter of learning trades and in mastering academic studies, there was little difference between the colored and Indian students. Now we're going to pause that right there, because, Booker T. Washington, he's up here talking about coloreds and Indians as though they were, a different people. But we know that the Indians were reclassified as colored in 1924 because of Walter Plecker. So, this man, he was just truly being an agent, right? So I just had to point that out. And it says, it was a constant delight to me to note that interest that the colored students took in trying to help the Indians in every possible way. Way possible. The Negro students gladly took the Indians as roommates in order that they might teach them to speak English and acquire civilized habits. Even more revealing is the grasp of enormity surrounding this experiment in racial relations. Says, I have often wondered if there was a white institution in this country whose students would have welcomed the incoming and more of the 100 companions of another race in a cordial way than the black students at Hampton welcomed the red ones. Now, this is another thing that I have to point out here, is because we already know that the definition of American is the aboriginal copper-colored races, and we know copper is a reddish-brown metal, which is like our complexion. So we know that he was lying. Booker T. Washington was lying when he said red and black students, and you already know when he said black, he was referring to the so-called Negroes, that he was trying to, paint the picture that the people that he referred to as Negroes were of African descent, which is a lie, because, for the most part, because most of the people that were called Negroes were the Indians, of course, right? And we know this for a fact. And we know that those same people that he was referring to as black and Negro are Indians, are the original Indians. And they are the people that was called red. It wasn't the Native Americans that we saw in the pictures, okay? So, anyway. So, that's that. So he tried to, I guess, he tried to lie or help the Europeans, reconstruct our history. That's pretty much what it sounds like, by making it seem as though that people that migrated from Siberia are the red Indians, when that's not the case. Where the red Indians are really us, the Negroes, the American Indian Negroes, are the real and true red Indians, because we have the copper-colored complexion, we have the red undertone, and we always had that red undertone, so anyways, I'm going to leave that there. Tell me what your thoughts are about this. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm out.